What we are about to share is the story of three sentences that silenced a room full of world leaders, turned a global summit upside down, and left even the most powerful man in America grappling with his own words. It is a moment where dignity stood tall against arrogance, where quiet resolve drowned out loud bravado, and where the world saw what happens when someone dares to voice what everyone else was thinking but too afraid to say. This is not just about politics or diplomacy. It is about truth slicing through pretense like a blade through silk, leaving everyone breathless, wondering, what does real power truly mean? The marble floors of the Geneva International Conference Center had witnessed their share of history. Presidents had strode these halls, treaties had been inked in these rooms, and the destinies of nations have been shaped behind these golden doors. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared this place for what was about to unfold on this crisp October morning. The Global Development Forum was an event where champagne cost more than most people's monthly wages, where handshakes carried the weight of billions, and where the term global responsibility fluttered about like confetti at a celebration. It was theater, lavish, costly theater where everyone knew their lines and performed with polished precision. Security was ironclad, tighter than a fortress. Metal detectors hummed, X-ray machines scanned, and armed guards stood ready, enough to secure a small nation. Every entrance was watched, every guest vetted, every word likely recorded. The Swiss authorities left nothing to chance with this assembly of global power. Inside the main auditorium, crystal chandeliers cast shimmering light across rows of meticulously arranged seats. The stage held a U-shaped table draped in pristine white cloth, with crystal water glasses aligned with military precision and microphones tuned to perfection. This was where the world's most influential voices would debate the future of international aid, global development, and what they called shared prosperity. The guest list was a roll call of global influence. Finance ministers from G7 nations, heads of development banks, CEOs of pharmaceutical giants, and tech tycoons who'd amassed fortunes while half the world lacked internet access. They mingled in the lobby, trading business cards and pleasantries as photographers captured their every smile and handshake. But two men in that room stood apart from the polished Geneva mold. The first was Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. At 35, he was young for a president, yet his eyes carried the weight of a man who'd seen struggle up close. He arrived without the usual presidential fanfare. No fleet of black SUVs, no swarm of advisors whispering in his ear, no press team curating his image. He moved quietly, almost invisibly, dressed in a deep green military uniform that stood out starkly against the sea of tailored suits. Traore had come to power through a coup, ousting a government many viewed as too entwined with foreign interests. His fierce calls for African sovereignty and anti-colonial rhetoric made him a hero to some, a danger to others. Western leaders eyed him warily, unsure if he was a visionary or a firebrand. What they all agreed on was his unpredictability, and in diplomacy, unpredictability was a nerve-wracking trait. The second man was Donald Trump, former and current president of the United States. He swept into the building as if he owned it, which, given America's sway over global institutions, wasn't entirely far-fetched. Red tie, immaculate hair, and that unmistakable swagger that had defined American politics for nearly a decade. His entourage filled two elevators. Secret Service agents, policy aides, media handlers, and staff whose sole job was to ensure their boss always appeared the most important person in any room. Trump's relationship with Africa was fraught. His past remarks about the continent had sparked diplomatic storms, and his approach to foreign aid was transactional at its core. To him, aid was not charity, but leverage, a tool to secure concessions and compliance, an investment demanding returns. The morning panels unfolded as expected. Rehearsed speeches on sustainable development, carefully worded pledges of partnership, and diplomatic language that said everything and nothing at once. The audience, government officials, NGO representatives, journalists, nodded politely, jotting notes they'd likely never revisit. But the main event loomed at 2 p.m., Global Responsibility and the Future of Aid. This was the panel everyone had come for, featuring heads of state and development leaders tackling the next decade of international cooperation. The moderator, a seasoned Swiss diplomat named Hans Weber, had overseen such discussions for 2 decades. He thought he'd seen it all. He was mistaken. As the lunch break ended, delegates streamed back into the auditorium, and a subtle electricity crackled in the air. Perhaps it was the clash of personalities, the weight of global challenges demanding real answers, or simply the moment when truth refused to stay silent. Trump took his seat at the center of a U-shaped table, flanked by European leaders who maintained a diplomatic distance while projecting warmth for the cameras. To his left sat the presidents of France, Germany, and Italy, Etienne du Bois, Karl Braun, and Sophia Rossi. To his right were the leaders of Canada, Japan, and Australia, all impeccably dressed, ready to deliver their scripted talking points. Ibrahim Traoré sat at the table's far end, almost isolated. The seating was no accident. Every inch calculated to reflect power dynamics. His position was symbolic, present but peripheral, included but not central, a quiet reminder of the hierarchy governing global relations. Hans Weber cleared his throat and opened with the usual courtesies. Distinguished leaders, honored guests, we gather today to address a critical challenge. How do we ensure international development assistance fosters lasting, sustainable change while respecting the sovereignty and dignity of recipient nations? It was a question designed for hours of discussion without a single firm commitment, perfect for diplomacy's delicate dance. The initial responses were predictable. Canada's Prime Minister spoke of partnership and mutual respect. Germany's Chancellor emphasized data-driven strategies. Japan's leader highlighted technological innovation. Each statement was polished, measured, and utterly forgettable. Then Weber turned to Donald Trump. Mr. President, the United States remains the world's largest provider of foreign aid. How do you envision America's role in global development moving forward? Trump leaned into his microphone, and the room shifted. The careful diplomacy, the measured responses, it was all about to unravel. You know what, Hans? Let's cut through the diplomatic fluff for a second. He began, his voice carrying the sharp edge that had defined his career. Everyone here knows the truth, but nobody's got the guts to say it. He stood, pushing his chair back with a scrape that echoed through the now-silent auditorium. We've given Africa more money than any continent in history. Schools, hospitals, roads, clean water, food aid, you name it, we've paid for it. And not just us Americans, everyone at this table. The Europeans, the Japanese, the Canadians, we've poured trillions into Africa over the past 50 years. Weber shifted uncomfortably, sensing the derailment. Mr. President, perhaps we could focus on specific programs and their measurable impacts. Trump cut him off with a raised hand. I'm not done, because here's what nobody wants to admit. After all that money, all that help, what do we get? Complaints, criticism, disrespect. A murmur rippled through the audience. Cameras zoomed in on faces around the table, some uneasy, others intrigued by the breach of protocol. Look at this room, Trump continued, gesturing broadly. Half the infrastructure that got these leaders here, airports, roads, telecom networks, was built with Western aid money. And instead of gratitude, what do we hear? Neo-colonialism, Western imperialism, structural exploitation. Give me a break. The French president, Du Bois, grimaced as if tasting something sour. The German chancellor stared at his notes. But Ibrahim Traoré sat motionless, his dark eyes locked on Trump with an intensity that seemed almost tangible. Some of these leaders act like they built their countries from the ground up. Trump pressed on, his voice rising, as if he were at a rally rather than a summit. Like they pulled themselves up without any help. But we know that's not true. We handed them progress on a silver platter, and the least they could do is say thank you. He turned, locking eyes with Traore for the first time. Some of you young revolutionaries think you can ignore the help you've gotten and pretend you did it all yourselves. But that's not how the world works. Success means acknowledging who made it possible. The silence that followed was heavy, not the polite pause of diplomacy, but the stunned hush of a room blindsided by audacity. Weber opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. President Traore, would you like to respond? Ibrahim Traoré stood slowly. No theatrics, no flourish, just the fluid grace of someone entirely at ease in his own skin. Unlike Trump's pacing, Traoré's stillness commanded the room. He didn't move to the center podium. He didn't need it. Standing where he was, hands at his sides, he spoke in a voice so quiet it somehow filled the entire auditorium. You gave us money, he began, each word deliberate, precise. This is true. The simplicity disarmed everyone. No preambel, no diplomatic venir. Just fact. But then his voice gained strength, each syllable a step forward. But with every dollar, you took our dignity. The words struck like a thunderclap. Delegates froze. Journalists stopped typing. Even the security guards seemed to lean in. And today, Traoré said, his eyes never leaving Trump's, I returned both. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was absolute, as if the room's air had vanished. No one moved. No one breathed. Only the faint hum of the air, conditioning, dared to break the void. Trump's confident smirk flickered, a flash of confusion crossing his face. He hadn't expected this, such a direct, unyielding response. That's very dramatic, Trump said, grasping for control. But drama doesn't change facts. Traoré stepped closer to his microphone, his voice now resonating like a low drum. Aid is not charity when it comes with chains. You build hospitals, yes, but you dictate our healthcare policies. You send grain, but you take our gold. You offer loans, but you own our resources. You call it help. We call it a transaction. Weber clutched his notes, desperate to steer the session back to order. The other leaders sat frozen, torn between protocol and fascination. Every road you pave came with conditions, Traoré continued. Every school you built demanded your textbooks, your languages, your systems. Every hospital you funded required your medicines, your methods, your protocols. This is not generosity. This is business. He took 3 deliberate steps toward the table's center, his military bearing evident in every controlled movement. You speak of gratitude as if we should thank the hand that feeds us while it picks our children's pockets. You demand appreciation for help that costs more than it gives. You want applause for assistance that makes us more dependent, not more free. Trump leaned forward, his face reddening. That's completely unfair. We've saved millions of lives. Famines prevented, epidemics stopped, infrastructure built. Traoré raised one hand, not aggressively, but with such quiet authority that Trump's words halted mid-sentence. The gesture was almost gentle, yet absolute. I do not deny lives were saved, Traoré said. I do not dismiss the roads, the hospitals, the schools. But I will not pretend salvation came without a price, or that the price was fair. He paused, letting the words settle. Then his voice dropped, each word heavy with conviction. Real power does not need to announce itself. It does not demand gratitude or list its deeds. Real power creates, empowers, and steps back to let others thrive. What you describe is not power. It is neediness dressed as authority. The precision of his words cut deep. Around the table, leaders shifted uncomfortably, reflecting on their own nation's aid policies. Had they, too, mistaken control for leadership? Traoré's voice grew hypnotic, each phrase building like a tide. You mock us for needing help, then design systems to ensure we always need more. You criticize our dependence, then structure aid to deepen it. You complain of ingratitude while making genuine gratitude impossible. Trump struggled visibly, his usual bravado faltering. Look, I never said, but Traoré pressed on, his tone steady, almost gentle, yet devastating. The hand that gives can be generous or possessive. It can open doors or forge locks. It can plant seeds or uproot trees. You have chosen possession over generosity, locks over doors, uprooting over planting. The metaphors were simple yet profound. poetry with purpose. And now you stand before the world, frustrated that your possessiveness hasn't earned love, that your locks haven't brought security, that your uprooting hasn't yielded gratitude. You blame us for not cherishing a gift that was never freely given. The room was transfixed. Traore's calm clarity made his words all the more piercing. For 60 years, you have treated us as children needing guidance. You built institutions to help us, but only in ways that keep you essential. Then you wonder why we don't trust you. Why younger leaders question your motives. Why the gratitude you expect never comes. He paused, and in that pause, the room's power dynamic flipped. Trump, once commanding, now seemed defensive, diminished. But here's what you cannot understand. Traore continued, his voice a near whisper that carried like a shout. Dignity cannot be given. It can only be recognized or destroyed. You have spent decades destroying ours while demanding thanks for the privilege. Each word landed like a hammer. You gave us money, yes, but with every dollar, you took dignity. You provided aid, but you extracted sovereignty. You offered help, but you demanded submission. And today, in this room, before these witnesses, I return both your money and your expectations. The final sentences struck with the force of inevitability, as if the entire exchange had built to this moment of clarity. We no longer need your helping hand if it comes with a controlling arm. We no longer want your assistance if it requires our diminishment. We no longer accept your charity if the price is our dignity. The silence that followed was profound, a vacuum where sound itself seemed suspended. Trump stood, mouth slightly open, for once without words, the man who never backed down, never conceded, now silent, smaller. Around the table, leaders sat stunned. Some looked awed, others uneasy, but all knew they'd witnessed something extraordinary, a power dynamic rewritten in real time. The audience, delegates, journalists, observers, sat motionless. Phone screens, once alive with social media, lay dark. This moment demanded total presence, a confrontation that would outlast policy details and memory. Hans Weber, the moderator, looked like a man watching his carefully planned event unravel. His notes, prepared for every scenario, were useless against this raw truth. After what felt like an eternity, likely 30 seconds, Trump tried to respond. That's an interesting perspective, he said, his voice hollow. But we need to look at the results of our aid, the measurable outcomes, the lives improved. It was a weak attempt to retreat to safer ground, to statistics and policy, where he might regain footing. But the moment had moved beyond such tactics. Traore didn't interrupt. He simply waited, letting Trump's words fade into the silence, proving through patience that he needed no fight for attention. His point stood unshaken. When Trump finished, Traore spoke his final words. Numbers tell us what happened. Truth tells us why it happened. Today, I have offered truth. Tomorrow, we will create new numbers. With that, he sat down. Weber, recognizing the futility of continuing, called a recess, but no one moved. Delegates sat processing, journalists scrambled to capture quotes, and cameras zoomed in on faces, shock, admiration, discomfort, awe. Within minutes, phones lit up. Social media buzzed as videos of the exchange spread. The hashtag #IReturnBoth trending before the session formally ended. Trump's team huddled, whispering about damage control, but what could they say? How do you spin such crystalline truth? Traore sat calmly, neither gloating nor anxious. He looked like a man who had done what was necessary, said what needed saying, and was ready for whatever followed. As delegates left, many approached to shake his hand or offer quiet support. Others hesitated, wary of political risks. Outside, a young journalist from Reuters caught Traore as he exited. "Mr. President," she called, jogging to match his steady pace. That was extraordinary. Are you worried about diplomatic fallout? Could this harm Burkina Faso's ties with Western donors? Traore paused, turning to her with the same calm intensity. Fear of consequences kept us silent for 60 years. Silence in the face of injustice isn't diplomacy. It's complicity. The world is changing. Young people are tired of polite lies. They want truth, even when it stings. But what about aid programs that might be cut? She pressed. What about the impact on your people? For the first time, Traore smiled. Not smug, but warm, resolute. My people have survived colonialism, debt crises, and decades of condescending aid. We will survive the transition to dignity. In fact, we will thrive. The journalist scribbled furiously, knowing every word would be dissected for months. A message for other African leaders? She asked. The same message for leaders everywhere, Traore replied. Speak truth. Serve your people. Respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned through actions, not words. He walked away, leaving the journalist and a growing crowd on the steps of the Geneva International Conference Center, grappling with what they'd witnessed. Within hours, the confrontation exploded across social media, shared millions of times, subtitled in dozens of languages. News networks led with the story. Editorialists struggled to capture its weight, while analysts debated its implications. In Washington, Trump's team scrambled to craft a response that wouldn't seem defensive or petty. In Africa, from Accra to Addis Ababa, people watched with pride, amazement, hope. Here was a leader who'd voiced their unspoken thoughts, articulated with power on a global stage. University students held viewing parties. Influencers made reaction videos. Artists began creating murals inspired by the moment. The phrase, "I return both," became a rallying cry for dignity movements across the continent and beyond. But the story doesn't end here. What happened next would prove that words, spoken with conviction, can reshape reality itself. 3 days after the Geneva confrontation, something extraordinary began to stir. It started quietly, in the shadowed corridors of power where decisions are made far from the glare of cameras. The words of Ibrahim Traoré, still echoing from that October afternoon, had ignited a spark that refused to fade. His 3 sentences, "You gave us money, but with every dollar, you took dignity, and today I return both," had not only silenced a room, but set in motion a chain of events that would ripple across continents, challenge empires, and redefine global relationships. In Berlin, Chancellor Karl Braun convened an urgent meeting with his development ministers. The agenda was unlisted, but whispers from within the room later revealed Braun's unease. Traoré's words hit harder than we'd like to admit, he reportedly said. We must ask ourselves, are our aid programs empowering people, or are they chaining them to us? By the end of the week, Germany announced a sweeping review of its African development initiatives, emphasizing what they termed dignity-centered partnerships. The phrase was no coincidence. It was a direct nod to Traoré's challenge. Similar conversations unfolded in capitals across Europe and North America. In Paris, President Etienne du Bois, who had sat stone-faced during the Geneva exchange, confided to his inner circle. Traoré said what we've all been dodging for years. France began quietly restructuring its ties with former African colonies, careful not to link the changes explicitly to Geneva, but clearly shaken by the moment. Even in Washington, where Trump's team was still reeling, career diplomats and aid experts started frank discussions about whether America's foreign aid model was achieving its goals or merely perpetuating dependency. But the real revolution was brewing in Africa. In Accra, Ghana's president, Kwame Mensah, watched the Geneva video 3 times before summoning his cabinet. "This young man has spoken for us all," he told them, his voice heavy with resolve. The question is, what do we do now? Within days, Ghana declared plans to renegotiate several aid agreements, particularly those with policy conditions that undermine sovereignty. The Ghanaian finance minister, Aisha Kruma, put it bluntly, aid should strengthen our ability to govern, not weaken it. Across the continent, the momentum grew. In Kenya, university students organized massive rallies under the banner of the Dignity Doctrine. In Lagos, Nigeria's megastar musician, Temi Star, released a song titled "Return Both," weaving Traoré's words into a pulsating Afrobeat anthem that became an instant rallying cry. Social media erupted, with hashtag #IReturnBoth trending in over 40 countries. The movement wasn't confined to Africa. Young people in Latin America, Asia, and even parts of Europe adopted the phrase to challenge their own experiences with patronizing aid policies. A striking moment came when indigenous leaders from Latin America released a video response. What Traore said in Geneva speaks to every community told they need saving by the same powers that caused their struggles, declared Camila Vargas, a Peruvian indigenous activist. The phrase dignity-centered development began appearing in academic papers, policy briefs, and UN documents. International NGOs scrambled to revise mission statements, racing to align with what was now called the Geneva Challenge. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré faced a different kind of pressure. His phone buzzed incessantly with interview requests from global media, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, Deutsche Welle. Everyone wanted more of the fire that had lit up Geneva. But Traoré was selective, agreeing only to interviews where he could discuss policy solutions, not just rehash the confrontation. In a poignant exchange with BBC's Amina Yusuf, he clarified his stance. The goal was never to shame anyone or reject cooperation. It was to demand that cooperation respects us as equals, not as beggars robbed of agency. Not everyone was cheering. Western think tanks began publishing skeptical reports. The American Policy Institute warned of aid nationalism's risks, while the Global Relations Council cautioned against anti-Western sentiment masked as sovereignty. Corporate giants grew nervous. Mining firms, agribusinesses, and pharmaceutical companies, whose African operations thrived on aid-dependent relationships, saw their models threatened. Stock prices for several multinationals with heavy African exposure dipped in the weeks following Geneva. The boldest corporate reaction came from Petroglobal, a French energy conglomerate with vast West African operations. CEO Julien Moreau called an emergency board meeting to address what he dubbed the Traore effect. Leaked documents later revealed the company was considering pulling out of countries where new dignity-focused policies might jeopardize their favorable contracts. In Chad, President Idris Mahamat announced a review of all extractive industry deals to ensure fair value for our resources and respect for our sovereignty. Similar moves followed in Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The economic stakes were staggering. Analysts at Bloomberg estimated that if even half of sub-Saharan Africa adopted Traoré's sovereignty-first approach, it could redirect hundreds of billions in resource revenues from multinationals to national development programs. But the most intriguing response came from China, which had watched Geneva unfold with keen interest. Unlike Western powers, who bristled defensively, Beijing saw opportunity. Chinese officials began contacting African leaders, offering what they called true partnership, rooted in mutual respect. At a trade summit, China's Commerce Minister, Li Wei, told African ministers, "We don't demand you adopt our systems or values. We want business as equals." This put Western governments in a bind. The more they dismissed Traoré's call for dignity as unrealistic, the more they reinforced his point about their paternalism. The more they insisted their aid had no strings, the more those strings became visible. Trump, meanwhile, grappled with a personal crisis. His brand, built on unyielding strength and always having the last word, had been dented. His silence post-Geneva was seen as weakness. His advisors were divided. Some urged him to attack Traoré, defending U.S. aid programs. Others warned that responding would only amplify the incident. The decision was forced when a conservative U.S. talk show host aired a segment titled, "The Ingratitude of Ibrahim Traoré." Meant to bolster Trump, it backfired. The host's condescending tone and selective data only validated Traoré's critique of Western arrogance. The backlash was swift. African-American leaders, previously silent, spoke out. Dismissing Traoré's call for dignity isn't just an attack on him. It's an attack on the principle that all people deserve equal respect, said Reverend Marcus Tate. The Congressional Black Caucus issued a statement endorsing Traoré's vision for dignity-centered relations. Even within Trump's party, younger voices saw opportunity. Senator James Carter of Georgia, a rising star, gave a speech at a Washington think tank, calling for American leadership that empowers, not patronizes, our partners. The Geneva moment was reshaping politics in ways no one had foreseen, blurring traditional left-right lines. Libertarians, typically anti-aid, praised Traoré's self-reliance. Progressives, usually pro-aid, questioned whether it perpetuated dependency. The intellectual impact was profound. Universities launched courses on post-colonial development and dignity-centered relations. A foreign affairs article by Dr. Elena Kim of Stanford argued that Traoré had exposed a flaw in post-World War II development thinking. We assumed good intentions excuse paternalistic methods. Traoré showed recipients have their own views on what help means versus control. Businesses felt the shift too. African entrepreneurs launched companies to reduce reliance on Western tech, financing, and expertise. In Uganda, a tech startup developed a mobile payment platform tailored to local needs, bypassing Western fintech giants. Partnering with local universities, it scaled across East Africa, proving the continent could innovate independently. The Economist ran a cover story, Africa's Dignity Dividend, showing that sovereignty-first policies were attracting investment and yielding better outcomes than aid-dependent models. The most powerful validation came from Africa's next generation of leaders. In South Africa, Thabo Kosi, leader of the Freedom Forward movement, hosted a continental summit, Dignity and Development, Africa's New Path. Despite Kosi's polarizing style, the summit drew moderate leaders committed to sovereignty-based strategies. Its declaration outlined specific alternatives: intra-African trade agreements to reduce external dependence, technology transfers to build local capacity, and resource policies ensuring fair compensation. The summit also announced the African Dignity Fund, a $50 billion investment vehicle funded by African governments, diaspora communities, and private investors. Its first project, renewable energy infrastructure across the Sahel, including Burkina Faso, designed and managed entirely by African institutions. The symbolism was potent. Africa solving its own challenges when given respect and resources. International reactions revealed deep anxieties. Western media often dismissed African institutions' capacity to manage such projects, inadvertently proving Traoré's point about paternalism. But thoughtful observers saw the shift. This isn't anti-Western sentiment, wrote columnist David Brooks in the Washington Post. It's pro-African confidence. Our relevance as partners depends on understanding that difference. The transformation was multi-layered. Governments renegotiated aid deals, corporations restructured operations, and citizens embraced a new sense of possibility. In universities from Nairobi to Dakar, students organized Dignity Week events exploring post-colonial identity and self-determination, not as anti-Western protests, but as visions for true partnership. The Geneva spark was spreading beyond Africa. In Sri Lanka, activists questioned aid tied to donor country purchases. In Ecuador, indigenous groups demanded NGOs act as partners, not saviors. The Geneva Principles, dignity, sovereignty, mutual respect, were becoming a global framework for reimagining development. Traoré's words had done more than challenge a room. They had ignited a movement, one that would soon face its next test, one that would show whether dignity could not only confront power, but reshape it for good. 6 months after the Geneva confrontation, Ibrahim Traoré was invited to address the United Nations General Assembly. The anticipation was electric, with world leaders eager to see whether he would double down on his confrontational stance or soften his tone now that he'd gained global prominence. What they witnessed was neither a retreat nor an escalation, but a vision so compelling it transcended the moment, weaving the Geneva spark into a blueprint for a new era of global relations. Traoré stood at the podium, his deep green uniform a stark contrast to the suits around him. His presence, as always, was quiet yet commanding, his voice steady but resonant. "We do not reject partnership," he began, addressing the packed assembly. "We reject paternalism. We do not refuse assistance. We refuse the assumption that assistance demands the surrender of dignity. We do not oppose cooperation. We oppose the idea that some nations must always be givers while others remain eternal receivers." The room, filled with delegates from every corner of the globe, leaned forward. Traore outlined concrete proposals, technology transfer programs to build local capacity, not perpetuate dependence, trade agreements allowing developing nations to add value to their resources before export, investment frameworks prioritizing long-term partnership over short-term extraction. Each idea was practical, actionable, yet rooted in the principle that had defined Geneva: dignity as the foundation of all human interaction. The speech's final moments carried a universal weight. "When we speak of dignity," Traore said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that filled the hall, "we are not speaking only of Africa's relationship with the West. We are speaking of a principle that should govern all human interactions. The recognition that every person, every community, every nation has inherent worth that cannot be traded for material gain. This applies to indigenous peoples in the Americas, ethnic minorities in Asia, working families in Europe and North America. Dignity is not an African issue. It is a human issue." The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, led not only by African delegates, but by representatives from the global South and even some from developed nations who saw the universal truth in his words. The dignity doctrine was no longer just a phrase. It was becoming a recognized framework in international relations. In the year that followed, the ripples from Geneva reshaped the global landscape in ways no one could have predicted. Law schools introduced courses on dignity-based international law. Business schools launched programs on respect-centered global commerce. Even military academies began incorporating dignity principles into training for international cooperation and peacekeeping. The 15-minute confrontation in Geneva had challenged not just Donald Trump, but an entire system of thinking about power, partnership, and human worth that had dominated global politics for decades. In Africa, the momentum was unstoppable. The African Dignity Fund, launched at the Dignity and Development Summit, grew to $75 billion within months, fueled by contributions from African governments, diaspora investors, and a new wave of entrepreneurs betting on the continent's self-directed future. Its flagship project, renewable energy infrastructure across the Sahel, began powering communities from Burkina Faso to Mali, designed and managed entirely by African engineers and institutions. The project's success silenced skeptics who had doubted the continent's capacity, proving that respect and resources could unlock transformative potential. In Nigeria, a fintech startup called AfroPay scaled rapidly, offering mobile banking solutions tailored to local markets, reducing reliance on Western financial systems. In Ethiopia, a cooperative of farmers and local researchers developed drought-resistant crops, bypassing multinational seed companies. These stories, once rare, became regular features in global business media, challenging the narrative that African progress required Western guidance. A Financial Times editorial declared, "Africa's dignity revolution is rewriting the rules of development, proving that sovereignty and innovation are not mutually exclusive." The movement spread beyond Africa. In Indonesia, student activists launched a campaign questioning aid agreements that prioritized donor country goods. In Guatemala, indigenous communities demanded that international NGOs shift from charity to collaboration, echoing Traoré's call for partnership over paternalism. The Geneva Principles, dignity, sovereignty, mutual respect, became a global lexicon for rethinking how nations and peoples interact. Western governments, initially defensive, began adapting. In London, the UK's development minister announced a new era of equitable partnerships, with aid programs redesigned to prioritize local leadership. Canada launched a task force to ensure its aid aligned with recipient nations' priorities, not Ottawa's. Even in Washington, where Trump's team still grappled with the fallout, a bipartisan group of lawmakers proposed the Global Respect Act, aiming to reform U.S. aid to emphasize empowerment over control. Though Trump himself remained silent on Geneva, his administration quietly scaled back policy conditions on some African aid packages, a tacit admission of Traoré's impact. Corporate responses were mixed. Some multinationals, like PetroGlobal, pulled back from African markets, fearing stricter resource contracts. Others saw opportunity. A German renewable energy firm partnered with the African Dignity Fund, co-developing solar projects that shared profits equitably. A Silicon Valley tech company launched a training program for African coders, not as charity, but as a joint venture to build local tech ecosystems. These shifts, though pragmatic, reflected a growing corporate realization. The old model of exploitative aid was no longer sustainable. China's role grew more prominent. Beijing doubled down on its equal partnership rhetoric, signing trade deals with African nations that avoided the policy strings common in Western agreements. At a summit in Addis Ababa, China's foreign minister, Zhang Mei, declared, "We offer Africa a hand, not a leash." While some African leaders welcomed the alternative, others, including Traore, remained cautious, emphasizing that dignity meant independence from all external control, not just Western. "We will partner with anyone," Traore told Al Jazeera, "but only as equals. No one will replace one master with another." The intellectual and cultural impact was profound. Universities worldwide expanded programs on post-colonial development, with Traore's speech becoming required reading. A viral TED Talk by Kenyan scholar Dr. Nia Okoye framed the dignity doctrine as the end of charity as control and the beginning of cooperation as respect. Artists across the global south created works inspired by Geneva, murals in Sao Paulo, songs in Mumbai, poems in Dakar, all celebrating the refusal to trade dignity for aid. Ordinary citizens felt the shift most deeply. In African cities, Dignity Week became an annual event, not just a protest, but a celebration of self-determination. In Accra, a young teacher named Adwo Aminsa organized a community forum where students debated what dignity meant for their future. Traore didn't just speak for presidents, she said. He spoke for us, the ones who've always known our worth but were told to stay grateful and quiet. The political fallout for Trump was enduring. His silence on Geneva, once seen as a weakness, became a liability. Younger Republicans, sensing a shift, began distancing themselves from his approach. At a campaign event, Senator James Carter said, "America's strength lies in lifting others up, not holding them down. Geneva taught us that." The comment, widely covered, signaled a broader realignment. The old hierarchies of global power were cracking, and even Trump's base began questioning whether dominance was the same as leadership. A year after Geneva, the world gathered for another global development forum, this time in Nairobi. The choice of venue was symbolic, a nod to the continent now leading the conversation. Traore attended, not as a peripheral figure, but as a keynote speaker. His address was less confrontation and more invitation, urging leaders to build a world where dignity is the currency of progress. He announced the African Dignity Fund's expansion into education, with scholarships for 1 million African students to study science and technology locally, not abroad. The closing moment of the Nairobi summit encapsulated the shift. As Traore stepped off the stage, he was approached by Germany's Chancellor Braun, who extended a hand. "We've been listening," Braun said simply. "We're ready to do better." The exchange, captured by cameras, went viral, symbolizing a new era where respect, not charity, defined global partnerships. Back in Ouagadougou, Traore remained grounded. He spent evenings meeting with local leaders, farmers, and students, ensuring Burkina Faso's own dignity revolution was more than rhetoric. A solar-powered school in a rural village, funded by the African Dignity Fund, bore his name, not by his choice, but by the community's insistence. "This is what we fought for," a village elder told him, gesturing to children studying under bright lights. Not just power, but pride. The world had changed, not because of a single speech, but because that speech had unlocked a truth too long suppressed. Dignity, once dismissed as a luxury, was now the cornerstone of a new global order. Nations, communities, and individuals were reimagining their worth, refusing to trade respect for resources. The old rules, where power demanded gratitude and aid came with control, were crumbling. But challenges remained. Could this movement sustain its momentum against entrenched interests? Would the world's powers truly embrace equality, or would they find new ways to exert control? And what would happen when the next generation of leaders, inspired by Traore, faced their own tests of courage? The answers were not yet clear, but one truth was undeniable. When dignity confronts arrogance, the ground shifts beneath everyone's feet. Ibrahim Traoré had not just challenged a man or a system. He had ignited a movement that would echo for generations, proving that the most powerful weapon against injustice is the refusal to stay silent. The world was listening, and it would never be the same.